Hello to our second Vanguard Roundtable, where we discuss topics that we believe need more attention in order to drive the human performance industry forward. Today's topic, we are going to look at mental health versus mental toughness. Before we dive into today's topic, we do want to highlight a few housekeeping items. Our North American Human Performance Summit is right around the corner. So visit humanperformancesummit.com to register and use the code Vanguard for a 25% discount on an in-person or virtual registration. The views expressed today are those of the individual panelists and do not necessarily reflect the position of Fusion Sport or the panelist organization. Please submit questions in the QA window, where you'll also be able to upvote each other's questions. We'll pause during the conversation to take a question from the audience, and we will also leave some time at the end for questions. We would also like your feedback today. At the end, I will be bringing up a QR code that has the opportunity to scan that QR code, and we will donate $5 to Girls Who Code. So for each survey completed, we will donate that $5, and we also want your feedback on that survey as well. For today's panelists, we have Dr. Uma Dorn. She is a licensed counseling and sports psychologist at Salt Lake Psychology. Sebastian Little, a leadership and performance coach at Sebastian Little Performance. Brian Alexander, a mental skills coach from UC San Diego. And then myself, Emma Ostermann. I will be moderating today's session. Before we dive in, we do want to do a poll to start this conversation off. So we're going to kick that poll off right now. This is not an anonymous audience poll. The focus on mental health for athletes or service members has come at the expense of developing mental toughness. So we do encourage you, before we dive into this conversation, to vote on one of those answers. And we'll leave it up here for a few more seconds, trying to get a few more people in. Perfect. Thank you so much for taking that poll. That just gives us an opportunity for our panelists to see kind of what our audience thinks and to help engage you guys as well. Perfect. Yep, so we'll go ahead and end that poll, and let's go ahead and dive into our conversation today. First up, we have Sebastian Little. And Sebastian, I'm going to kick off this first question of how do you define mental health as compared to mental toughness?
Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me on. This is super exciting. Thanks for everybody who's in the audience. I love this question. I think it's one that's super relevant in the athletic space. I'm actually going to take this a little bit out of the context of even just sport and answer it more broadly. So in my background as a life and leadership coach, I get trained. My training is really in ontological coach development and leadership. We make the distinction between coaching and therapy as a pretty distinct line. And I'd love actually for my panelists to jump on at this point, at some point, and kind of give me your own thoughts. But the way that we think about the mental health conversation is more of a therapeutic conversation, right? Typically what we're doing is we're looking more in the past, right? And a therapist as a clinician, they can prescribe, they can diagnose. And in that context, you're unraveling what happened in the past. Usually there's something around trauma. You're looking at what is the underlying source and being able to start to heal that. Healing work. When I think about a mental toughness conversation, I think about it being more of a coaching conversation towards performance. And now we're starting to shift our perspective of looking at what does the individual athlete need in terms of bridging their own gap from where they are right now to where they want to go. So the conversation for me shifts from going from more of a past-based conversation around making sure you're trying to remedy something, get something back up to health, versus what is the next jump in your gap in your performance, and how do we close that gap? So it's more of a plus conversation versus trying to fill the delta of the void.
I want to jump in, of course, kind of from the mental health side of it. I do think there's this perception of mental health being more a deficit or pathology-based model, but I would say for me and my perspective, is that it's more strengths-based and more wellness-based. And so I see mental toughness. And I will say, like, that word itself that I probably struggle with. For me, it's like this idea of resilience, or this kind of knowing where our mental limits are and working to kind of expand them. And mental health is kind of a part of that, or a piece of that.
Yeah, I love to dovetail on both of those comments on mental health versus mental toughness. First and foremost, I think I'm a certified mental performance consultant, and in light of the publicity of the Simone Biles, case of getting twisties at the Olympic Games, there's been a lot of publication and media attention to mental health and athletics, and they came out and made a statement, which I agree with, that mental health is a continuum that ranges from thriving to disorder. So we usually think about it from thriving as like wellness versus disorder as illness. And then there's different people trained in different ways to address those goals that you might have around boosting your mental health, something that I think we all have, just like our physical health. So we can look at it not so much from a pathological point of view all the time, versus just, okay, where are you on this mental health continuum? And what kind of support and services do you actually need to help you get to just functioning versus thriving?
Those are all really great points. And I do want to just do a follow-up question. There's mental health and mental toughness. Is there any other term or word that you've heard associated, whether it's in athletics, regarding anything related to that?
Well, I like, again, mental resilience, that there's mental skills that we talk about in kind of the performance area, and even like kind of mental strength. That's probably another one that I've heard, but yeah, I'm curious too if folks have heard other terms.
Yeah, I've also heard mental fitness, which is a new kind of growing buzz term, I think, in terms of that idea of it's not just when there's a problem, let's just work on your fitness, as well as, this is kind of more catchy, but mental wealth, instead of mental health.
Those are all really great words. I think at one point I did hear mental tightness, as just another word just to describe, the mindset that you want to be able to share with your athletes or the individuals that you work with. Those are all really great points. And I do want to keep this moving along. Brian, I'm going to come to you with this next question. How do you assess and monitor mental health and mental toughness in a performance program?
That is a great question, because I think any great work starts with assessment. And we have to get really good at not jumping to conclusions right away from just, what we think we see, especially as we're training coaches to boost athletes, feelings of support, vitality, and well-being in their program and cultures. So what we've done at UCSD, we've actually created a performance plan, sort of development plan, that identifies these pillars or principles around what does it look like to have this both, mental toughness balance, if you want to call it, or I like to use more of the resilience piece that Dr. Dorn was talking about. 10 different pillars that we actually built into SmarterBase. And then we asked the athletes to reflect on their past week. How are you doing in these areas? And so, we have 6 mental and then 4 life balance. So it's stuff like emotional regulation, performance enhancing self-talk, motivation. We talk about routines, and then we also talk about core values, and we talk about life organization, and we also talk about mental recovery, time that you can just disconnect from your sport in order to reconnect with a little more balance. So we try and do that on a weekly basis, then use that to inform us and combine it with the observation, which is the unstructured assessment of what we see out there when we're working.
I love the idea of mental recovery. And I think that just gets me really excited. And I do think it starts with assessment and that monitoring that happens regularly. We talk about, the physical side pretty consistently. We're looking at nutrition, we're looking at where they are physically, and we have trainers. And I think in the same way that mental checkup should be part of that process, and that we're looking at that emotional and social health there as well. So.
I'll add a little bit of a different angle on this. I love the idea of assessment of where we are now and like how do we actually close the gap. A lot of the work that I do with folks, and again, this is more athletes through the lens of life coaching, is looking at their world and where they want to go. So the question, of course, there's always going to be metrics that are performance indicators, like a high performing culture, a high performing athlete. There's going to be certain things that are going to be kind of a constant across or a baseline across the board. But the next question is, okay, so what do you want to do with it? And I love to be in the conversation with the athletes around and coaches and staffs around, hey, what is the next kind of breakthrough we're aiming for? And how do we get there? That's a slightly different conversation because it's more exploratory, often involves more creativity and partnership. And once we have the baseline established, we can really look to what's next. So assessment for me is ultimately comes back down to asking the question, what do you want? Which is a question that we get asked a lot, but not actually, we'll throw it around a lot, but we don't always actually sit and take time to think about what is the thing that I really yearn for, I truly desire. Let's go get that.
And I think
so that's, oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to
say the same thing. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right. I think if you're doing monitoring just for the purposes of monitoring and not doing anything with it, it is absolutely kind of not helpful, right? If we're just monitoring and having data or doing an assessment and then we don't actually think about what's next, it kind of is pointless and not really helpful for the athlete.
Yeah, I think we see that too a lot of times down in the trenches with athletes. They're inputting all this information, they're sending it off into the ether, and then they're never hearing anything about it. And they're like, well, what's the point, right? How is this going to benefit me? How do I use it? So, Sebastian, you just kind of triggered the idea of goal setting, but having informed goal setting and not just those outcome-based goals, but also here's the big dream. Let's break it down into performance improvement targets, and let's break that down into process-oriented steps that are more short-term, and let's flip that upside down in terms of what we focus on, so that we can really drill into the process. And I don't say trust process. I think we have to follow a process, which is to your point, but then keep improving.
Those were all really great questions. And we have had some questions that are coming in as you guys are keeping the conversation going. One of the questions that came through was, how does this approach change when dealing with an athlete returning from injury? Obviously, you do your assessments. Coming from a performance coaching side, I understand those assessments, but does that change with what you're looking at, how you're communicating with the athlete as they come back from injury? And Uma, I'm actually going to kick that over to you to kick us off with that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is, again, going back to kind of what are they needing, and really understanding how is the injury impacting them. I think oftentimes for some, it may be a quick bounce back, and for others, it might not be. And to kind of know where they're at, I think it's really helpful. The other piece of it is that I think it's really important that there is a touch point, whoever that might be, to think about that mental side of recovering from the injury. I think that there's both the physical recovery and the mental recovery from an injury, and that can be at any given point in the continuum, right? It is also from just being injured all the way up to like getting back into the sport, and what does that look like from the mental side of things?
Emma, can I throw one more thing on this as well? Awesome.
Of course, go for it.
Uma, I love your answer. I actually want to take the perspective. I want to put myself back in my playing days. So I played football at Yale University. I tore my ACL, MCL, and meniscus my senior year, game 5 of my season, came back for my 5th year, started my first game back. And I say that only because the journey was more important and what I want to pull out of it. And the thing that I learned about myself, but also the process, was how important the social circle was along the way. And it's something that's easy for us to forget, particularly it's like, hey, the strength staff or the medical staff has this person, they got him, right? And they did, they had me. But the check-ins, the touch points that I really craved were with my teammates and with my coaches. And the mental thing the thing that I did, the social thing that I did, I actually created an ACL group chat with everybody else that was going through a similar injury. If you had a knee injury, I included you. We were inclusive in this thing, but we brought people together that were going through a shared experience. And I had some other outlets to make sure that was a healthy experience, even in the frustration. So of course, there's going to be the frustration, the pain that goes through recovering from an injury. But what I want to speak to is like the social and the mental aspect. Those really go hand in hand with having me made a full recovery and then get back on the field the next year.
That's great. Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, and there was also another question that came through, and it's, do you track anything when working with your athletes before going into a competition? Is there like a negative or positive influence on the mental side that you guys would look at? Or is it a continuum that basically just stays the same, whether it's an off season, in season, out of season? Do you guys approach things differently through different periods?
I'd love to take that one because I think that falls right into the wheelhouse of mental skills training, which is what my education is in, performance psychology and sports psychology in the applied sense. And I think something that, especially around mental health, is we tend to take a reactive approach a lot of the times when we talk about it. But what we're trying to reinforce is this idea that mental skills are meant to be practiced. And so that may speak more towards the mental toughness aspect, as Sebastian was alluding to, right? It's like going from where you are to where you want to be, and what kind of skill sets align with that daily training. I didn't share this earlier, but I think mental toughness is kind of a abused term, and we came up with some other terms, but I also think of this term called malleability. And what that really means to me is, you can push on by force when you're bend, right? And you're going to use those skills as you're bending. You're kind of working around this force maybe planned for, you hadn't planned for, or you just didn't know you needed to, right? But you're never going to break. And when it stops pushing on you, you're going to go back to form as you continue on. So that's part of the idea. And a lot of times, as we're preparing for competition, it's about what can I control? And can I control the controllables? Yeah, so.
I think, like you said, you hear that term a lot, whether it's coming from, if you're working with a sport coach, you hear, I want to build mental toughness, I want to build mental toughness. And it may be hard to distinguish the difference between the two, especially whether you're a sports performance coach who's not as familiar with, what does mental toughness mean in a sports setting versus, a psychological setting versus, a strength and conditioning setting, which I was used to. But with that, can you advocate mental health while also encouraging mental toughness? Are they in opposition, or are they complementary of each other? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Can I go back to the previous question around tracking? I guess for me, the one thing I think that Brian talked about was this idea that mental skills have to be practiced. And so I think for me, when I work with athletes, the big thing to let them know is like, not to have situations where they're practicing what it feels like to be in competition, but also in competition to have this experience of having what the mental skills, what actually happens. And oftentimes I think we kind of maybe focus on this idea of like, what's my best performance, or how do I get better? But also like the idea of like I teach folks to also visualize when they did make a mistake or they did fail, and then how did they bounce back? Because that's the part that we need to keep building on and keep kind of encouraging to do that. So I think in terms of tracking, I think it's more like, yes, maybe you're tracking differently, but it's more about what do you use and how to use that with the athlete. I think that's more important. Yeah, I know I went into that question, but
No, that's perfect. I think that's a great point. And I think that does tie in with that next question that I asked. And Sebastian, I do want to throw that over to you. I mean, especially with the group that you worked with, and you've probably heard it as an athlete, is you want to build mental toughness. You want to build mental toughness. Do you think they are in opposition of one another between mental health and mental toughness, or do you find them more complementary of one another?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Whoever asked this, this is so even in the way that it's worded, right? What can you have one or the other? It actually creates a paradox for us, which means that you can have either or. And I think that the perfect marrying is a combination of both and, right? So it's complementary, but I'd actually even put them in as integrated. I think as a coach and a practitioner, you can only go as far with your team as you're willing to rest them, right? So if we look at them being, the power is actually in the paradox, the power is in polarity, both and. If you're going to advocate, hey, go take care of your well-being, make sure that you go to that therapy session that you talked about. It's really important that you talk about what's going on at home. You can go further there. If you do that, you can go further into pushing your athlete to performance, or what we would kind of consider traditional performance. So I actually think that the more willing we are to go to one end is also gives us permission to go to the other, and they don't exist without each other.
Very well said. Uma, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I love what you just said, this idea of both and I think it also goes back to what Brian was saying earlier, that it is a continuum, right? They are all on that same spectrum in that line, and that if we see it as two opposing things or different things, then I think we are missing to really address the whole person of the athlete, which is, I think, really what, if we do that, their performance will be better.
That's awesome. Thank you. This conversation has been amazing so far. So thank you guys for all of your responses. I do want to keep it moving forward. And Uma, I'm going to come to you with this next question of how do you get the performance and coaching staff on the same page when it comes to mental health and mental toughness?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is changing the kind of the language and the narrative around it, because I think there is still this perception of mental health equals bad, mental toughness is good for performance. And then I think being really careful about not necessarily emphasizing one over the other, right? I think it is this balance of having both. And also providing specific, I think oftentimes providing specific tools and language in how to approach athletes around mental health and mental toughness. I think oftentimes there's this fear of, I can't talk about mental health, that must be something the psychologist needs to do or the therapist needs to do, but knowing that just like Sebastian just said a minute ago, like what would it be like for the coach to say, hey, I think you need to go to that therapy session. That's great. How can I support you in doing that? That your well-being is just as important, but that coming from the coach makes that much more accessible for the athlete.
Brian, I know you work with a variety of teams in the college setting as well. Do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I agree with what Uma said about just educating the coach, giving them language that's common language, also making it okay to not be okay, as we've probably heard by now in the media. It's a cultural, shift. And I'd love to hear from Sebastian too, because he's in the he's the tough sport as a football player, but I play water polo, and that's also one of those things where it's like, hey, get punched in the face, don't talk about it, just be tough, keep swimming, keep going. It's part of the game. Or you're gonna grind, don't worry about it, get over it. It's that kind of stuff, but we don't want to lose that aspect of competition. We just want them to know that you need to take care of yourself as a person first, and then an athlete second. And there's certain ways to do it where it's performance enhancing versus performance debilitating. You can do both.
John Maxwell talks about the level of the team will never exceed that of the level of the leader. I always go one level further. The level of the leader will not exceed that of the level of the system or the culture that they live in, right? So one of the and the reason why I bring that forward is if you as a coach aren't doing your own work, not necessarily therapeutic, not necessarily coaching, but doing your own work actively, you are clearing for the rest of your team, right? So the permission your athletes give themselves to take care of themselves happens when they see their coach go home for dinner with their kids. It happens when they bring work-life balance to work and they actually have their 2-year-old running around the practice field. So the level of the leader actually gives the team permission to go take care of themselves. But if they're not eating well, or if they see them in the film room super late eating pizza every night, credibility comes off a little bit, and so does the permission for the rest of the team. So I actually even look at this as a cultural conversation if we just continue to elevate this, right? Looking at different angles. But yeah, as the individual, I totally agree with what Uma and Brian put forward. And when we look at the system, what is the system actually saying yes or no to? And I think that's a super important thing when we look at people being willing to go step into and ask for support, which is very, very difficult to do, even more difficult to do when you don't quite know as a high school or college athlete.
Yeah, and Sebastian, you said that really, I do think we have, it's not just the coaching staff, right? It is administration, it is further up, right? It is across the board, and we have to be educating across, because the pressure just doesn't come there. It's across the board. And how do we kind of shift the culture to yeah, I mean, and I would say athletics is notorious for not shifting that, not being in that culture of, well, kind of that mental health and wellness. So how do we kind of shift that across the board?
I think what we have to start to practice is, and it's what we do when we do any type of training or teaching. There's kind of 3 different levels usually of like assimilation with the content that we're trying to provide. There's language. I'm going to give you some new language. Here's some new terminology we can go use together. Great. That's typically happens in a training. You get somebody external to come in, everybody walks away, they're really happy with it. And then usually within 72 hours, we've forgotten most of what we talked about. The next level of it is real skill building. And then what I love about this conversation is we're starting to get into the how, like just the nature of the work that we do. So you go from language to skill to true identity, where I start to identify that's how I do things, or that's how we do things. And now we're talking about a value conversation. And when the value conversation, it starts to look at team norms and culture. So when mental health or mental toughness moves from the language of it, the sexiness of it, into now skills, we can now use a focal point. We can use breathing and meditation. We can use different calls and communication on the field or in the locker room. Now we start to have an identity conversation, and that is really where the juice happens, and that's where you see the consistency happen over time.
You guys both spoke about the system and changing it from, an administrative level, and that can be really difficult, especially like you guys all said in the collegiate setting. Is there is there a check-in period or, a touch base period that you find that you would have to do, whether it's, hey, I need to check in with this group every so often just to make sure that they're staying educated and the points that we made 2 months ago are still staying in contact? Do you guys have any advice on that in terms of those touch base or just check-in periods for the system-based that you guys spoke about?
Oh, I could just share the frequency with which I usually meet with teams, but it's sort of a model of service where you really have to, you're going to be a change agent in the system, right? It starts with the buy-in and just mastering the art of hanging out, right? I think on my point of view, I just hang out sometimes and I feel like I'm totally worthless and not doing anything. And then all of a sudden they see my face and I start to get some trust built and rapport built. And all of a sudden they're saying, hey, and I'm like, oh, hey, you see me, right? And then if I know their name, boom, that's a big one. But then all of a sudden there's this one day where you're there, and if it's one-on-one or the coach or whomever, they ask you a question and then bam, you've got an opportunity. So you've just gained entry if you can sort of even just use your counseling skills and actively listen and give them an opportunity to sound off on what they're seeing and how they're experiencing. But a lot of that does also work through your relationship with the coaching staff. And obviously there might be more on top of that, depending on who's bringing you in and paying, maybe paying for your services or whomever. But I think it always comes down to that, right? But then I usually try and meet weekly or just be around weekly, at least once a week, if not more, so that they feel like you're a part of what their experience is as well, right? Because there's that covenant to athletics where if they don't feel like you're given some of the sacrifice or some of the consistent showing up aspect, I don't even know what. If you're that, then you're in the team, right? So you have to kind of get that buy-in. It's hard. It's an art. It's not necessarily a science.
I definitely understand that, especially when I was a performance coach. We sit in on these weekly performance staff meetings, whom I know you're familiar with that as well. Sebastian and Ryan, I'm sure you guys are also familiar with that. And that kind of helps with that check-in point. But when it comes to building that relationship, Ryan, you hit on the head of, you need to build a relationship with the coaching staff. Do you have any recommendations on how you would go about that to build that relationship, so then you do get that buy-in when it is time, to have those conversations that need to happen?
Well, I can share the way I do it, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's definitely a one-size-fits-one approach, depending on how well I know the coach, how well I support. well as, what kinds of similar connections do we have? But it starts usually with just like a discovery kind of call, because if they're seeking me out, or if I'm available to work with them, well, then there's something that hopefully we can find to work on, right? So I just want a state of the union, and maybe even not just with the team yet, maybe it's just with the program. Just tell me a little bit about the history of your program. I would love to know your coaching philosophy. What do you stand for? I just want to be a sponge and really just learn from you, because then all of a sudden you're giving them the power in the conversation. And I think they're usually used to that too, right? Like, this is their team. You're coming in to add value. You're not coming in to just take it away. So I think that's always, and it's kind of an assessment process, right? So it's kind of like the first step I usually take, just gaining information, trying to have open dialogue with them, and through that, sometimes you need that maybe elevator pitch to share, like, what kind of value can you add, what do you offer, what kinds of things do you work on, and then you kind of customize it if you have the opportunity from there going forward.
I would say similarly to Brian, I think it is about that relationship and creating space for that. And I think much of it is also empathizing with their role that they're in, and really understanding the complexity of what that means, and what is kind of what they're doing and what its impact on them and their well-being, right? And I think kind of coming in from that empathetic role can really help to then build those relationships, and then hopefully connect and open up dialogue about the athletes.
Get really nitty-gritty and tactical here. We're speaking really to, like, how do we maintain and build a relationship so that we can be effective, right? Because if we're not in relationship with somebody, then we're just consulting, we're throwing stuff at them. I love the equation, a touch point equals quality times quantity times frequency. So a touch point is any interaction you have with somebody else, right? Quality is the type of interaction. That could be call, text, FaceTime, Zoom, physical touch, acts of service, right? Now you start to get to like love languages that we might call. Quantity might be like, I need to go check in with the head coach once a week. That is what he or she needs in order for us to be in relationship. And the quantity might be an hour, right? Frequency might be once a week. So I look at it, I'm always constantly looking for, what does this person need, right? Do they really responsive via text? Well, I'm going to shoot them just a text, a podcast via text, right? Maybe they really need more in-person time. So it really requires a stop in their office. And I'll be looking at, like, how do I create relationship and maximize my time? Because that's not a finite, it is a finite resource.
No, I think that's great. Thank you, guys. And I think, Brian, you said it best. As a support staff, you're there to add value. Coming from that performance coaching side, the value I would add was, hey, these are their metrics, their testing numbers, and this is how they're performing on this side. But when it comes to the data you collect on the mental skills side or the sports psychology side, how do you know which data is appropriate to share with the coaching staff and which isn't? Because there is going to be some conversations that happen where, hey, that information might be pertinent to know, especially going into a competition or a heavy practice. But also understanding that there is that door where it's like, hey, I can't share that information. How do you distinguish which information you're able to share and which you aren't? And Uma, I'm going to kick that one off to you first.
Yeah, I think this is really tough on the mental health side of things. I mean, I think when it's more performance or mental skills, like, I feel a little more comfortable and I can, but when we get into that blurred line of where that starts and where it stops, it gets really complicated, because a big part of why therapy works is that there's confidentiality, and that the client can trust that that's going to be kept. And I think for me, the hard part is not always knowing how that information is going to be used. I've had where that information then gets used in ways like, you can't play in the game this week, those kinds of things, which then really kind of, again, reduces trust, and then also hurts kind of that trust with the coach and the athlete as well. So for me, I think it's really tough. Typically, I try to provide like aggregate kind of data, or here's some general information, or here's some themes that are coming up. And knowing the coach really well and knowing what kind of how do they align with all of this, and then maybe being a little more about, this athlete needs something extra this week, and maybe not getting into specifics, but more talking about what their needs are and kind of helping them to support the athlete in that way.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I also fall into this dilemma sometimes, right? Because we want to honor that confidentiality and that privacy. And a lot of times too, I hear that from athletes when I meet with them one-on-one, like they really value that separation from the coaching staff and someone that they can just lean on. So we have to remember who's our real client, right? Who's our real client? Even though there's certain people that get you in the door, certain people that give you an opportunity to work with the athletes, I think the athletes are the one reason why I'm there. Even though I'd love to be able to coach the coach, and a lot of times I am just through being there, as well as having challenging conversations and just asking those questions around maybe, something that we agreed to earlier in their season, and now that they have real-time results, now we're, maybe veering off track a little bit. So ask a question that brings them back on maybe, or just gets them to think about it in a different way. But using the data too, I think I usually have a plan, right, before I just ask for the data. And I'm usually including all the stakeholders in creating that plan. So kind of sharing like, well, this is the expectation about, I use that mental training and wellbeing scoreboard through SmarterBase. So this is the expectation about 4 times throughout the year. My plan is to average each area and give you sort of like a little graph and show you where your team is right now. Not with no one's names listed, right? Athletes, how do you feel about that? What, and we have dialogue, like what could, come of that, right? And I'm obviously going through all these ethical situations in my mind too before I get there. Maybe even going through an ethical decision-making model with other peers outside of it, so I get a different perspective. But then in addition to that, I'm also asking them like, what would be really valuable with this data to help your team perform at a higher level, right? And so then maybe we get creative together and kind of innovative and come up with some kind of display of that, right? So it's all that stuff put together to sort of support them and obviously, like I said, add value to it.
That was perfect. Yes, thank you guys. And I think that transitions really well into this next question of what are the limits within your specific role and how do you bridge that gap to give individuals access to the resources they need? And what I mean by that is, once again, I come from a performance coaching background. And then you also have, sports nutritionists, dietitians, athletic training, sports medicine staff, who may all experience a conversation with an athlete or an individual that they are working with. And it's what information or what feedback can I give them? From my own experience, I know it's knowing my own limits and understanding my limits of what talking points that I can give to that individual, as well as the relationship I've already built with that individual, as well as this idea of breaking down these silos. And what I mean by silos is if you have mental skills or mental health in one silo, sports performance in another, strength and conditioning in another, sports nutrition in another, and you're just all staying in your silo, are we creating organic conversation? Do we have anything that may be pertinent to the other person in their silo, quote unquote? Or are we coming together and sharing each other these tidbits of information that can help for the athlete's sake? And my biggest takeaway for that was communication and transparency. As long as we're communicating, with one another, and I do bring Uma into this because I have worked with Uma before, was especially in the weight room, how can what she is doing and what she's working on also help in the weight room side of things? And one of the biggest things that we did was, hey, this was a theme that Uma was going to highlight this week when working with a specific team. And within that theme, I created a team event or team challenge that also brought that theme in. And that was one way that we worked together to help bridge that gap. I'd be interested to hear from either one of you. How do you guys see bridging that gap between those different quote unquote silos that ever all in.
I think, I mean, that was a great example, Emma, and I loved that work that we did together. I mean, and it was really quick, right? I came in and did this 5-minute presentation on a mental skill, and then you kind of used it in the workout, you know, and in the weight room. And I think that was really helpful to kind of help the athletes see how we can bridge it, because I think they also see it as kind of siloed, that this is mental health, this is one thing, nutrition is one thing. But if we kind of all speak the language of all of our kind of counterparts, I think it can really help to go back to what Sebastian was saying earlier, but help to create an identity around this, that we all value all the pieces of what makes us the best performer.
I love this. I love this question. This one gets me fired up. There's something about this, about how do you actually work as a team of teams, which referencing the book title as well, highly recommend that if you're interested in looking at how do you bring together multidisciplinary teams that do things really well individually, to it being interdisciplinary. And I think where ultimately we're going, and even in this conversation, we've talked about the continuum that we're on, it makes us shift into being integrated or intradisciplinary teams. So Emma, to your point, having your nutrition team, your performance team, all of them separate, every time we have a gap in a system, in a team, on a front line, it's an opportunity for us to get exploited. So it's in the breakdowns between teams that we usually see communication drops or competition, right, for resources. And we've all bickered about resources. They have more, we don't have as much. All of those are taking away from us actually staying focused on the objective, which is to win, to support our athletes, to support holistic health, you name it, right? So I think part of what we can do from the get-go is, even from your first kickoff meeting of the year, the annual one of the year, is to set really clear expectations of how are we going to work together in service of the mission that we're trying to achieve. I think the breakdown happens when the expectations are unmet or unspoken to. And everybody could talk all they want about communication, but if we don't actually vocalize, and Brian, to your point, make visible these things, you know, all of a sudden we're going to have issues, not in week 1 of the season, we're going to have week 7 when we're going to the big game, right? Because there's going to be a breakdown that we hadn't spoken about.
And I think oftentimes we do this reactively rather than proactively, right? And I think, Brian, you were speaking to that earlier, but I think it's really important that we think about this on the front end, because it's often in when things happen is when we're like, oh, there's a communication breakdown. But what if we kind of think about it on the front end and really help to create a communication plan, or have us kind of be on that same page at the very onset of it?
Yeah.
Go for it, Brian.
I was going to add, you know, a lot of great organizations now are creating high performance teams, right? They have a high performance model, and they have different pillars within that model, which cover all those things that you mentioned. We at UCSD, we're in a transition period from going from Division II to Division I. But we hired, the university athletics department hired a associate athletic director of high performance and well-being from a national governing body of all of sport of a country, right? So there's a model in place with all these people, specialties in place, and your job is to work as a team wrapped around each team, but probably more importantly, each individual athlete, right? To support every need they could have in terms of high performance, right? And so in order to do that, like Sebastian was saying, get exploited, you tend to hear about it, and then we take the reactive approach. Versus if we can get ahead of it and set clear expectations, and also procedures and strategies that we can follow through on, then and have continuous check-in, because we're not just going to set it and then it's going to ride out perfectly, right? We're going to set it, we're going to hit road bumps, we're going to constantly have check-ins, we're going to make adjustments, we're going to educate one another on our different specialties, and try and really make each one the go-to professional if that comes up in conversation with the individuals or with the coaches or with the teams. But still, we're going to support the high performance model all the way through, and then hopefully everything else kind of happens where they're advocating for it as well. So it turns into a system, right? It's not just necessarily like, let's throw it against the wall and see what sticks.
I love that. And I think one of the things that was brought up was, bridging the gap. As a performance coach, whether a sports psychologist and mental skills coach, what do you feel you're comfortable with, with someone in my position to be able to speak to an athlete about? You build that trust with an athlete, especially from a performance coaching side or a sport coaching side, where you're with that athlete quite a bit of time, and they build that level of trust. And I think you were the one who noted it, was you build those people who you have that trust with. And do you give guidance to those disciplines, to those individuals on, hey, if they come to you regarding this, these are kind of some of the talking points that you can speak on? Or do you guys provide that guidance for any of the coaches or individuals that you work with?
So we did a little bit of training on what we called kind of like first aid kinds of things, but like really helping to have, again, I think there's this like, oh, it's a mental health issue, I'm not going to touch it, right? And there's this sensitivity around it. And yet I think it's as simple as like, how are you doing? Is everything okay? How are you doing outside the field, right? What's going on and off the field? And really, it's those personal relationships that, and in some ways that you might have more so than I might when I'm only touching in with them maybe one hour a week. And so in many ways, it's that relationship that will hopefully bridge some of that. And so it is doing those check-ins in the way that we would do with anyone else, but I think we get anxious about when it starts to move into that mental health field that maybe we may need to shy away from it.
We're lucky to have a really good counseling and psychological services department, and I've kind of gone through a lot of ethics training in my professional educational path, and knowing what are the boundaries of my competencies, and knowing how to make referrals, and knowing kind of what the resources are and having them ready beforehand. So even having like a referral list for different needs with direct contacts and all that is really useful in terms of being professionally ready, I think, to support people.
And I think, Brian, what you were saying is really right on, because I think, but you might be the one poised to do that referral or to make that connection to maybe them needing to see a therapist or a psychologist, because again, oftentimes they may not come to us until they hear someone they trust kind of being the one to encourage them to go.
Those are really good points. And Sebastian, I do want to pose this question that came through in the chat towards you. It's, how do you assess an athlete who may use mental health as a potential excuse or their safety blanket? And at what point do you start to switch it over to mental toughness, resiliency within that athlete?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. Yeah, I think it's, and there's another question on here as well, is like, when do you know when to push? And I think it's all at a gradient, which is the classic non-answer from a consultant or coach of like, I'm not going to answer the question. But on a more serious note, like I do think that we coach to a gradient, and you're not going to coach a freshman the same way you're going to coach a senior. So being able to look at what is not only what the behavior is showing right now, but also what's that a symptom of? What's the actual underlying cause? If we're seeing erratic behavior over time, is that because there's an untreated something, or is there an issue at home? We can actually get curious about that. But with that, it actually becomes a partnership conversation with the athlete, because what's not going to go well is when we approach somebody and we say, hey, here's how this is going to happen, or you're doing this, or you're this way. When we say you're this way, we start going into our own shame cycles or shame spirals from Brene Brown's work. And when we're in that place, we're not going to get out of it. So as soon as we come with you are this way, or your mental health is holding back the team, we now close off that athlete. We actually can't support or help them, right? So I think the first thing, to Brian's point, coming with questions, he's talked about it a couple of times. How are you? What's going on in your world? Even short, sweet, pointed questions about what's going on in their world gives us more access to support. Now we can start to look at, well, this is a mental health or this is a mental toughness thing. And now we can do that in partnership. I think we're seeing that more and more with the Generation Z athletes and millennial athletes. They want to be involved in their decision-making, and we can't go grab a face mask like we used to. I was at the very end of that in my career, grabbing a face mask and yelling into it. That doesn't work anymore, right? So we can get mad at that, or we can adjust our approach and be more effective in what we do now. And I think it looks like partnering with the athlete.
I love that. And, and from the performance coaching side, it can be tough, especially when you're in the weight room or on a court or on a field. It's, I am trying to build this mental toughness, or whatever word you want to input there. How do I know when to push? And what helped for me when I was coaching with those athletes was, like you said, build that level of trust. And that came through conversation, having an individual conversation with those athletes to want to get an understanding of what kind of coaching style do you respond to? What kind of coaching style have you had in the past? And it was really trying to dig deeper on how I can get the most out of that athlete, when things are starting to get hard. And the other thing was, hey, if I'm collecting this data, there is some data I'm going to share with you. So know where you are. And if they're having a bad day and it's like, oh, this is really hard. It's, well, yes, you are lifting way heavier than you have ever in your life. That's a good thing. And it's kind of given that visual stimulus, that visual feedback. It's, oh, I can see that now. And so those are some of the ways that helped me when I was, in that coaching realm.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think it is that conversation piece. And I think maybe even shifting our mindset of this is an excuse, and maybe it's also trying to figure out how do we kind of know, like, what is their push points and where do they want to be pushed? Like you were saying, Emma, it's like having this conversation of like, not when they're in the moment having it right beforehand, saying, how do you want me to challenge you? And what does pushing look like for you? And when do you know when your limit is? And if you do, what would that communication be for me? Like, how would I know that for you? And really kind of, again, going back to like building that relationship, I think. So.
I agree, learning about the people, asking them, how do I support you? But I think we're just touching the tip of the iceberg on the mental health discussion, which is important, right? We're talking about it. But one of the focuses, I think, when you shift from mental health to mental toughness or just mental training, let's say, is how do we get more solution focused rather than problem focused? Because one of the things that we haven't really talked about, but is motivation. And as coaches, a lot of them think you have to motivate our athletes, and you can't necessarily motivate anybody. But what you could do is you can create a climate and environment where you support their psychological needs, and you create a climate that's performance enhancing, that's both task focused as well as that ego focused component. And now we're really thriving, right? And it's built on some more theory in there too, like self-determination theory and all those things, and even like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you want to go that deep and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's something, and that takes education on the coach's part, as well as just constant reinforcement, because the stress of the job is so challenging.
I think part of that is that it takes time to do that. And oftentimes, we want those results or those outcomes pretty immediately. And knowing that in order for that, creating that environment or that space, it's going to take time and really building it to make it happen.
Those are all really great points. And, we are getting close on our time here. And I do want to pose one more question to the group, because I do find it really interesting. And this came through on the chat of how do sports psychologists and mental skills coaches come together and work together? Is there a difference between, say, on the sports psychology side, on what you're going to touch on when working with an athlete, versus on the mental skills side, what you're going to work on when working with an athlete? Do you guys have anything, Uma, Brian, or Sebastian, regarding that?
I'm happy to, I was going to say collaboratively. I mean, I think we are, we have to be in communication with each other and really kind of meeting where the athletes are, and knowing that, sometimes I might be moving into mental skills or performance related, and being sure that we're communicating. And similarly, there may be things that come up that in the mental skills side that it's important to bring up too. And so I think it's that constant communication and being in touch, because because honestly, athletes may not know the difference. Like, what's the difference between going to psychologists and mental skills, and what's that difference, and where does that line again begin and end? And so really helping to both delineate for them, but also being in constant communication with each other.
Yeah, I agree. And I also, I mean, we may have said this, but we didn't really say it. Somebody could really be challenged with a mental health need and still be able to perform. My focus is on the applied sense of, okay, you're performing, you're functioning on a certain level, and let's make sure if you need help there, we get you the support you need in that presenting issue or concern. But we're going to focus on how do you become a better performer on the field or in the gym or the pool or wherever, right? That's my role and my scope. And as we talk about these things, which we can, we don't want to stigmatize them. I'm just going to reinforce, like, maybe that's something that you should speak with your therapist on, or your counselor, the person that's clinically trained, because honestly, they're going to probably be able to help you more in that area. And I wouldn't want to overstep that. But chances are, and what I've seen is, we're still talking about breathing, we're still talking about self-talk, we're still talking about imagery and visualization and goal setting and all those kinds of things too, just in a different context.
Sebastian, from the private setting, do you see a difference in that as well with the individuals that you work with?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest difference is that the folks that I'm working with are going to be independent contributors versus working within a team or organization. What's also awesome about a college or professional sports team is you have people under one roof, right? Which is also looks like usually shared confidentiality, legal agreements, liabilities, so all those things that start to get messy when you start pairing people. Both in my training and in my experience, there's been a couple of times in working with a therapist with a client. And what's important is that the client empowers that relationship. And it's really, really intentional about the client is taking anything that they're bringing back and forth. They're the one connecting us. They're the one facilitating the whole process. And in the private sector, they actually almost sit as the middle bridge, and we actually get to support them on both sides. I think in an academic or collegiate setting, a lot of times those are all in-house. So it ends up being more in the same arena. Absolutely works. It just requires a little bit more intentionality in setting up the agreement up front.
These were all really great points today. And like I said, we were getting close on time here. And I do want to invite Uma, Sebastian, Brian, do you guys have anything you would like to add as we start to close out today's session?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. I just say thank you to my fellow panelists. This is incredible learning from both of you. Emma, thank you for facilitating this conversation. The questions that came in were incredible. So I also wanted to just thank the folks that were here and attentive. This conversation starts to shift when we start being willing to have it. I've noticed that particularly even in the diversity, equity, and inclusion realm over the last year and a half, we're willing to come to the table now about it. And all of a sudden we're starting to see some shifts. And I think the same thing happens here with something that's been historically stigmatized and is now becoming more on the front line. So thanks for being here. And I'm just grateful to be part of this.
Ditto.
Yeah, really well said. And I also think there's one more piece to this to keep educating the general public. And like Sebastian said, thank you to everybody that attended, because we can always learn so much more together. But there's different specialties within this mental health and mental training area, right? It's similar to the physical side, right? You have strength coaches, physical therapists, the yoga instructor. I mean, you got like so many different things, right? So like, we're coming to realize, one, there's a need here, but there's a lot of different areas and pockets of need that have specialty in this aspect of just, thriving and well-being. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you to all of you for joining us today. We are very appreciative to Uma, Sebastian, and Brian for you guys for hopping on. And like I said at the beginning, we do want to hear everyone's feedback. So that QR code that is up on your screen right now, if you use your phone and scan that code, just tell us how we did today. What do you think of the conversation? Do you have any suggestions or anything that you would like us to consider in the future? And with that, with every survey that we receive, we will be donating $5 to Girls Who Code. As for upcoming events, we do have our next Vanguard Roundtable coming up November 17th. We will get more information as well on that. But once again, from Fusion Sport, thank you so much for joining us today. Uma, Sebastian, Brian, thank you for all of your guys' insight. We do appreciate it. And then for everyone who stayed on and listened to the conversation and submitting those questions, we do thank you as well. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much.